This is KB on the Go. Okay, so welcome to KB on the Go, and today I'm on the go at Tech Leaders 2023 conference here in the Hunter Valley, which is 2 hours north of Sydney. So Tech Leaders is the premier networking and education event for journalists and technology vendors in the IT and cybersecurity sector. Running across 2 days, the event brings together government representatives, industry analysts, and 30 technology journalists to hear from, including influential technology companies. The event has evolved over more than a decade. It's a fun weekend and a perfect opportunity for the industry to come together. And today I'm joined by Phil Sim, the CEO of Influencing, and the very company who has put on this event. So Phil, I want to start with your view of the media landscape and how it's changed.
Well, it's almost how it is changing, because I actually think it is in time where it's getting fundamentally different. I'm an old school journalist, and we put this event on because I think journalism is about relationships and deep understanding. And I think we went through a pretty poor period in media where SEO took over and it was about quantity, not quality. And I think what media organizations now are realizing with the threat of generative AI is that they need to write stuff that a robot can't. And so I think we're getting to this point in time where media is having to get better and it's having to go deeper. And it's the people that are producing content, like yourself, need deep knowledge about a sector, because otherwise you can ask ChatGPT stuff. So if you're doing a better job than ChatGPT in media, you're not going to be around any.
Would you say that people are using ChatGPT purely as a media capability, not adding in any nuance or any sort of deeper understanding about the space?
I think there's different ways people consume media. So there's news content that you use to keep up with what's changing. And then there's more the research capability. A lot of media over the last decade has been built on that research side of things. So people looking to make a purchase or people looking to research a strategy, they end up reading media articles because they're the most definitive sources, hopefully. I think if you're asking a question and it's more general, people are going to increasingly not bother doing the legwork of doing a whole bunch of Google research, and they'll just ask ChatGPT to pull all that together.
So I had a discussion with one of the journos here last night, and we're talking about the industry may come full circle because, like you said, there's going to be thousands, millions of articles being leveraged by ChatGPT, which is run-of-the-mill sort of stuff. And now people are, as in consumers, are going to be focused on finding those publishers, those influencers, those media people that are out there to actually really drive the right conversation. So do you think that maybe we might start to see a bit of a full circle back on the media landscape moving forward?
I do. As I said, back when you had to write a front page story in a newspaper or magazine that grabbed people's attention, then they had to open it. That was what sucked you into media. So you had to come up with fantastic content. So we're going full circle back to that, where the old values of old school journalism, which is about uncovering stuff and giving readers something that they will truly value, that's what we're going back to.
What about a focus on like beat journalism or beat reporting? Do you start to see a focus on that so people do more specialized reporting rather than, like you said, more generalized high-level stories?
100%. You can ask ChatGPT to write interview questions for you, and it will do an okay job, the same as you could get an intern to write interview questions for you. But it's only when you've been in the sector and you know the topic content, not only know the right questions to ask, but you know that there's a point that you've got to call bullshit on something, or you've got to get them to go deeper and justify. That's value that you only get when you've been in the beat and you know the topic and you know the people and you know what someone else said 2 years ago, and you can call them on it or challenge them on. And AI doesn't challenge you on it. It's not about forcing you to think. It's about giving you answers. And the answers are not always right. And that's what humans do. They can question and challenge the answer.
So do you think now, as we traverse into this still uncharted territory about with ChatGPT, where the media landscape's going, because it was already declining before that, and now people are probably a little bit nervous considering we don't know what's going to happen. Do you think that it's going to force people to get that level of specialization and force them to be asking harder questions and force them to not just rely on ChatGPT to write banal questions?
I consume so much of my content today on YouTube, and it's specialists who have very deep knowledge and get very interesting guests. And so again, a lot like you're doing. And I like video. I think that's the other part of how media is changing. And for the moment, we have an advantage on AI because putting together video or audio is more challenging than putting together words. So I think that's another way that people's content consumption habits are changing. And that's probably just as important as what can be generated through automated fashion.
So what do you think moving forward? Where do you think we go from here? So when I roll back here in 2024, where do you sort of see the discussion being, and what would be your advice for publishers out there that may need to think about how they are going to market, how that, people are consuming media, whether it's video or podcasts or anything like that? Do you have sort of any advice or any sort of insights?
We're going to see some very interesting examples of publishers asking people to pay for content. So within the tech sector, you have Innovation Oz, which goes very deep into government policy and issues like that. They've put their content behind a paywall. We've just seen the launch of Capital Brief. So it's basically a business media that is all behind a paywall. So what I hope is going to happen is that consumers of content are going to realize there's a difference between free content and content that you're prepared to pay for.
So again, it's the full circle conversation again, because historically there was paywalls and then it went away, so it was democratized. And now we're going to see paywall because it's like, well, I could get democratized content, but it's quite generic, so I'm quite happy to pay for it.
You can even take, so if we want to move forward past next year, where I see, there's a trend in AI that while everyone's talking about ChatGPT and Bard and things like that, a lot of the really interesting AI models are about multiple models. So you can train a specific AI to do something really at a much deeper rate. So perhaps media start to use their content to have their own AIs. So if I wanted to ask a question about security, I ask AI, because all of your content forms a knowledge base that instead of using search, I just ask a question. So it's this swings and roundabouts of how technology is applied, and it's going to continue to evolve almost daily.
So I'm joined by Anthony Woodward, CEO from Logicalis Australia. So Anthony, good to chat to you again. So I want to start with what's been on your mind and what concerns you. So you spoke around human error, decision error, and the example is that companies have this decision to hold onto data that companies shouldn't be holding onto. So curious to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for that. What I would say is that we see a lot of organisations that have maybe need to do a bit of work in the area of what their core assets are that need to be protected. So a good example is, do we need to keep every driver's license that we've ever scanned since the dawn of time? Is that an important asset to hang on to today? Why that's critical is because it then governs what kind of systems and processes you put in place to protect that information.
Would you say because of large major breaches in Australia, people are a little bit more cognizant around the data that they currently have? Do they need it? I understand for authentication purposes that why people have it, but then what do they hold it? Why do they have to keep a driver's license for a customer? Is that relevant, would you say?
Well, one of the things that has come up is, I guess, a disconnect between where the regulation stands and what you really need to do business. Sometimes there's just an open question where they're not even sure how much or for how long that data should be kept because whatever legislation they operate under isn't clear about it. So that's an area to think.
So I remember asking someone, well, why do we need to hold, for example, someone's driver's license? And the reasoning that I was told was, well, for example, if you're working in telco, you don't pay your phone bill, they need to send a debt collector after you. We need to retrieve your identity to get a debt collector after you. But if you're doing business to business, you don't sort of have people's driver's license on you and you still can send debt collectors. So I'm just curious to know, is there any impetus though to keep driver's license? I understand maybe the response that I got, but I still don't see the need for it. So what's your view?
Well, I think the identity piece is quite broad. So it depends on the regulatory environment the organisation is in. Sometimes they may need to show, for example, law enforcement agencies identity data for somebody who may have committed a crime under the Telecommunications Act. And that would, I think, be something that governs what telcos do. But the question is more, once you are no longer a customer, do we need to keep that data? And that's
why are people keeping it though?
And I think the reason is because they may not be able to pick out the data that is of their current customers versus their past customers. It's just all in a big pool of data. What I put in my presentation, which is where you have legacy systems and processes. So if the offboarding process doesn't cover that, have we deleted the data that is no longer relevant for this customer that's leaving? Then that's a system or a process that needs to be updated. So it's less about necessarily protecting the data itself and more about making sure it's just not there when it shouldn't be.
Would you say that a lot of companies are in this boat around we can't determine who's a current customer and who's left?
I don't know how many customers are in this boat, but I think we've seen evidence of some organisations that are in that boat from some of the recent breaches that we've seen, where data that goes back 10 years or more has been breached.
Would you say that people now are getting their ducks in a row to make a change?
Absolutely. Nothing gets these things on the agenda more quickly than the potential brand damage that has come from some of these significant cyber breaches. But what I would also say is that it has really helped the conversation with the governance of organisations. So the board level conversations are much better informed and are actually generating real activity.
When you talk about governance, as I've worked in a GRC function before, and there's a lot of policies and processes and procedures to follow, but it can be hard to follow when you've got other things to do each day, trying to keep the lights on, especially if you're in a smaller team, right? So how would you, in your position, approach a proper governance structure? Because again, it's like, in theory, it makes sense, but then, when push comes to shove and you get to the practical of day-to-day security operations, it's hard and it goes by the wayside. So do you have any sort of advice around how to manage that effectively?
Well, a pragmatic approach is key. So if you're an organisation that is able to articulate what your risk profile is, so, okay, that data about those customers is super critical. We really need to protect that. Perhaps some of the other things that we could potentially think are important actually turn out not to be so important. So yeah, maybe we won't keep that data, or maybe we'll store that in an air-gapped way so that it can't be accessed because we don't ever really need it either. They're the sorts of things that would govern your GRC process that then says, okay, so we've identified the core assets that we really want to protect, and that means the control systems that we've put in place needs to be this, this, and this, as opposed to a system that does everything.
And then what sort of, since we last spoke around a year ago, is there any sort of insights that you'd like to share or anything that you want to illuminate today?
Yeah, I think probably because of the fact that cybersecurity's profile has risen so much over the last 12 months with the various things that have happened, what we're finding is organisations are saying, we know we need to spend money in this area. We need to have a pragmatic approach to exactly where. But on the flip side of that, the day-to-day operations have the potential to suffer underneath this environment. So what we tend to do is, this is why we position our managed services in such a way that we say, if we're managing a platform for you, then there is security baked into it. And so that's an area of coverage that you then don't have to necessarily have so much of a concern about. So yes, it will need to deliver what you need for your governance and risk framework, but the more of it that you have under the management of a service provider that's got a platform with security baked in, then that takes some of the risk off the table.
Would you say from your discussions with some of your customers or potential customers that people are a little, like, security is becoming the forefront now of their concern? We passed, yes, the regulation, yes, the reforms, yes, major breaches and, the PR debacle that comes with. But would you say that if we didn't have those incidents, do you think we'd be in the same position we are today?
I'm not sure. What I do know is that the conversations moved from how do we defend against this to how do we respond when it happens. So it's moved from a sort of fortress mentality to a resilience mentality. And I think that's really refreshing, because what it means is that things like business continuity plans and disaster recovery and backups and all those other components then also fall into the envelope of how do we protect against a cyber incident, which for some of these significant breaches that you've seen out there, if they'd been able to put their hands on good, clean blast backups, then that becomes much less of a cybersecurity risk.
So I'm joined by Zeus, CEO of BizCubed. And so Zach, thanks for being at the conference. I want to talk to you a little bit more about your thoughts on data operations. And I mean, your view is whether it's strong or weak, but you have a view. So I'm keen to hear it.
Sure. BizCubed is a data operations firm or data engineering operations firm, and we really focus on helping organizations get control of their data capabilities. And one of the things that we've learned is that when you have control over your ecosystem and your environment, you have a much stronger posture in addressing cybersecurity issues, maintaining organizational resilience, and also responding to remediation or challenges that come up from time to time, whether that would be a potential cyber risk or a CVE announcement. We're able to help our customers respond to that quickly, efficiently, but also we know when we're done. So because we do such a good job of building out sort of the data registers, the data process registers, we can very quickly say, oh, there's 9 activities to be done. And we can then demonstrate that we've done all 9 activities and we know that the cyber issue is resolved on time. And importantly, we can demonstrate that to the CISO, the risk officers, our business sponsors, and the technical teams around us. And one example of that recently was there was a change freeze put in by one of the business partners until the team had addressed the cybersecurity risks that had been identified. And because of our operational and focused approach, we were ahead of every other team in the business in putting the remediations in place.
Okay, so let's go back to the CVE side of things. So obviously, it's a large register of thousands of CVEs. From your experience, would you say companies overlook this a lot? Because you could, as a security team, you can come forward and say, okay, well, here's a list of CVEs and this is what's happening. But I feel like maybe sometimes the business doesn't pay attention to that. So my question is why?
When there are thousands of things, it becomes a large list. So you have to assign capacity to drive that list down or go through that list and categorize it. And you have other requirements, other demands on your time, so it's not a priority, or until it becomes a priority, as in the CISO says, thou shalt, don't make any more changes until this is done, or it's an easy thing to overlook. The other side of it, though, is organizations, in my experience, don't have operational processes around new CVEs being released or new capabilities coming in. Now, they might from the CISO perspective, but that doesn't flow to the operations teams inside the organization.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's the CISO's job, not the operations team's job.
But why isn't it flowing down?
Conflicting priorities, and the people who are making decisions about the allocation of resources, they're KPI'd on new features, going to market, getting new customers, the business outcomes. They're not KPI'd on the CISO outcomes. The CISO is KPI'd on the CISO outcomes. Until those outcomes are shared, accountability, or the business actually is held to account for doing those things, it's not going to hit the priority list. There's other things for them to do.
So then what would be your recommendations for people listening, how, that can become a priority in terms of, you said before, around organizations don't have strong operational processes. Is there any sort of recommendations that you would sort of impart?
I think the first problem is they don't have strong operations around their data, full stop. And so putting a cyber operation on top of that, it's
more complexity.
Yeah, it's adding more complexity as opposed to building out a simple process. And so the first recommendation is get your data operations in very strong order. And that's where BizCubed has been building our capability for the last 17 years. And then use that order to then apply that same order to the CVEs or other security issues that come through your organization. And so by providing that sort of operational consistency, that operational rigor, it creates the opportunity for cybersecurity operations and rigor.
So what do you see moving forward? Do you think that these types of problems, this sounds like a very rudimentary problem, but a lot of problems in cybersecurity seem relatively rudimentary if you even focus on patch management. And I always default back to it because we've been talking about patch management for 20 years. Yeah, it's still a very hard thing to do. What you're saying makes sense, but then I guess practically it's hard to employ in an organization. So what do you think moving forward? Do you think these problems will get better?
I think the context of this is IT and technology is a really immature industry globally. We don't have strong operations around technology generally. And part of that is technology is still evolving very, very fast. And so we get excited by the new stuff that's coming in, and we run programs to build new capability, but we actually haven't built the strong operations capability around technology as an industry. And so it's an opportunity, I think, for organizations who do have to build out that operational capability as a competitive, it's not quite a differentiator, but a competitive differentiator activator. So if you get really good at your operational processes, so patch management is obviously one of those, you then can not have your cybersecurity or your systems issues get in the way of the business that you're trying to achieve. For example, when this change freeze was put in place, we were able to get our ecosystem approved for new changes much faster than the rest of the organization because we had been so operationally rigorous about the way we ran those operations, and we could address the cyber issue operationally. We were able to provide faster change for the business as a result of that rigor. But that's an uncommon outcome, not the way most tech organizations are run today.
I'm joined by Kurt Hansen, CEO of Tesserent. So, Kurt, lovely to speak to you again. Now, in your session yesterday, you touched on Tesserent's innovation. So maybe just want to expand a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, look, in the early thinking was, as we grew Tesserent to be a more substantial, scalable, influential player in the industry, we didn't just want to be a services business. I don't mean that in a negative way. We do a lot of good consulting, managed services, but we wanted to make an impact in really sort of supporting local initiatives, particularly around intellectual property, a la software development. So we took some investments in a couple of businesses. TrustGrid is one, which did some digital licensing for New South Wales government, and also Daltrey Biometric. And that was quite interesting for us. Unfortunately, Daltrey didn't get the rest of its funding required. It recently went into receivership. But
Why do you think that is?
Oh, there's lack of VC support, lack of just, that's a whole other unpack, supporting startups in Australia.
Oh.
We lack the size of the market for them to generally get, for a software business to get to scale, just in 25 million versus obviously the overweight, US market, Europe market. So, obviously if you want to be a cybersecurity software startup, you want to be in Israel or Silicon Valley or primarily, to get that investment support.
You make a great point, and I think a few people over the last couple of days have touched on that. Do you think that's a bit disappointing, though? As an, obviously you're Australian business.
Yeah, when we sat around our board table and we were disappointed by that, and we thought, well, we're building a services business that's going to be profitable. We'd like to put some of those profits back into also generating some innovation. So we made some investments. However, we also, as a result of some of the businesses we brought together, we had intellectual property contained in some of those businesses, particularly in working with some of the federal government and defence businesses, where we'd been working on projects on a time and materials basis, developing IP. So recently, some of those those clients said, well, you can retain the IP if you're going to further commercialise and develop it. So we took that opportunity to do that. So about 3 months ago, the board approved about $3 million to be invested into those initiatives. Now, those initiatives, if you ever been to a meeting where the other person has got 2 mobile phones?
I was one of those people.
Oh, you were one of those people. Great. Because you didn't want to have things inflicted upon you from the business onto your personal device. Or more importantly, the business also didn't want to put its information on your personal device.
State type of thing.
That's right. Yeah. So we think that's horribly inefficient. So one of the projects that we're going to bring to the market in innovation is around virtualizing the mobile device and being able to actually have, containerization around secure containerization around having enterprise, and so the enterprise has got confidence that there's not going to be any leakage.
So I just want to quickly touch on the Thales acquisition. What's happening with that?
Well, it's a proposed transaction at the moment. It's still got to have Foreign Investment Review Board approval, which should be happening in the next couple of weeks, we're told. And then it goes to a shareholder vote on the 18th of September. We then go back to the courts, and then if that's the courts would approve all of that, and then we'll move off to the ASX into a single shareholding arrangement with Thales on the 4th of October.
And then as you sort of traverse now with this acquisition, what's going to happen now, like with Thales sort of taking over and the acquisition and the merge and everything? So what can people sort of expect moving forward?
Yeah, well, Tesserent's going to remain as an entity. I mean, Thales understand that we're a business that's, only recently, the last 3 businesses, including the Academy business, has only just happened. So they know that we still have been acquisitive. They like our 3-year plan that we put in place earlier this year. So they want us to continue to operate as an entity. However, and in fact, they've got a very small cyber practice in Australia, only about 35 people. They're going to integrate that into our business. So we'll be the cyber security practice for Thales Australia, and probably do a bit of work in Asia Pacific for them as well. As in
their internal practice, or do you mean Thales Cloud Security?
So there'll still be those elements of Thales that do cloud, and they have their other products businesses. But in terms of the cybersecurity services business that we'll basically be driving that, our existing businesses because they don't operate into the commercial markets as we do. And although we're quite strong in federal government and some defence areas, they are probably stronger. They've been working with defence for 100 years, so they have opportunities and access to parts of that market that we don't have. And we'll be able to compete there, with some of the bigger names quite effectively as well. So we'll be able to build out and grow our business in that area quite effectively. But the plan is to remain Tesserent as an entity. We'll still have a changed board of management, with Talis people being involved, and we'll run it that way.
I'm joined by Stela Solar, Director of National Artificial Intelligence Centre, hosted by CSIRO. So thank you, Stela, for opening today's session. Now, I want to start with, you mentioned that AI's top challenge was security, but conversely, the top benefit was security. So talk me through this.
We've recently conducted analysis around Australia to find out how the commercial sector was using AI. And yeah, we found out the top challenge with AI is security and the top benefit is AI. So we tried to unpack what this really meant. And what we're seeing is a general leveling up of both the opportunities and the challenges that we're already facing as a society, that businesses are already tackling, but they're being leveled up with AI tools. So AI tools can create tremendous benefit, but they can also scale unintended consequences. And so right now, it is important for business leaders to take steps to shape AI systems to ensure that they're responsible, inclusive, and really lean into those positive opportunities.
Do you think that we will now start to lean into more positive opportunities, like as we traverse forward the next 12 months? Do you start to see that happening?
We find that business leaders want to implement AI well. There has been a gap in guidance in how to do that. So whether that be best practices or frameworks or standards, generally, there hasn't been end-to-end guidance in how to do it. But now we're starting to see a wave of that coming through. One example that I shared today are the standards. So International Standards Organization has already released a number of AI-related standards, and there are many more coming. And these are grounded in some best practices of how to do AI well, and that's what businesses want to do.
You mentioned before, as part of your presentation, you talked about the APATE project with Macquarie University. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on that, what it means and what it does?
We always love seeing great examples across Australia of innovation, and with generative AI really having caught the imagination of our society, it's interesting to see it used in different ways. And so Macquarie University's cybersecurity hub developed an app called Apate. Apate is the goddess of deception. And in this app, they're leveraging generative AI technology to actually create a chatbot that can converse with phone scammers. So when phone scammers call you to get your personal information, you can point them to Apate, and then Apate can actually give them, a false name, false number, and essentially it wastes the time of the scammers. So it's a really interesting use case of seeing generative AI used differently.
Do you think that people are worried about AI from your point of view because of large media organizations and top-line stories are positioning it maybe not in the right way, that AI is a benefit?
I think we're all learning what AI is as a society, where we want to use AI, what we value, where we don't want to use AI, and where we want to lean into different processes. So we're all on this learning journey. And, AI term itself is not new. It's been around since the 1950s. But over the past year, we've really seen mass engagement with AI tools because of how easy generative AI is to use. And so through this mass engagement, there's also a mass learning that is happening. And this means exploring what the opportunities are. It also means understanding what the challenges are. And as we go through that process, definitely there will be questions that are posed that can be a little bit scary. But then we look at what those major challenges are we're facing globally, such as climate change, such as the escalating health imperative. We are needing tools that can tackle scale well, and AI presents that opportunity. So lots of opportunities to be had. But as we're going through this learning journey, of course, there will be some questions and fear that also comes up as part of the process.
And you made a great statement, which I loved, which was AI is not good or bad. It's just how we use it. And so that sort of drives my thinking towards my previous question around sometimes how the media interprets AI. And maybe sometimes it's about correcting them on the path that it can be used for bad. There's also a lot of good that comes from it. Is there anything specific that you'd like to highlight around what AI is being used for good in our society?
So quite often we connect AI with bias, but just as effectively it can help us tackle bias. And I love the example of Sapia.ai. It's an Australian company that has a chatbot for early stage interviewing. And it was found that the chatbot process was actually more likely to hire women than what a human-bodied interviewer would. So that is interesting. But what was even more revealing is when you looked at the analysis the Sapia.ai conducted, they found that when women were told that they would be assessed by an AI, 30% more women applied for the roles. And so that suggests that members of our society might actually feel more fairly treated by an AI system than by a person. And so it starts to suggest that bias is all around us. I mean, we've already faced it in our lives even without AI. Now that AI is here, could it help us intercept those biases and break some of those patterns? And that's what I hold great hope for.
And just quickly to conclude, you said that Australia is one of the most nervous countries in the world for AI. Where do you think that nervous reaction stems from?
Again, I think we're all learning about this topic. There are probably multiple factors that go into it. You know, traditionally, our sources of economic growth, 2 of the top 3 are mining and property ownership. And so technology industry and innovation have not yet been those big contributors that we have many employees working in that sector. That is, of course, on a dramatic rise. And so I think we're going to start to see more technology careers and more comfort with the technology topics come up in Australia. Maybe also in the education sector. You know, we'd love to see more experiences that students have with technology. Recently, I was involved in Day of AI, where 100,000 students across Australia got hands-on with the technology and they loved it. You know, they were drawing, they were training the AI system to interpret data, to find anomalies. This kind of interaction early in education is just so important to catalyze and ignite that imagination, and then also have comfort to embrace new technologies that come.
I'm joined by Matt Hurford, Vice President and Managing Director of NetApp. So, Matt, thanks for presenting yesterday. Talk to me a little bit more about what you did present on.
Yeah, absolutely, Carissa. Look, we talked about the themes that are impacting organizations' ability to create the data they need to drive a digital business. So we talked about complexity of the environment they run in, the skills shortage. We spoke about cost, always top of mind with executives, and also about sustainability, which is a topic I'm quite passionate about, and making sure that we do our part to reduce the carbon footprint.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I did an interview with someone last week talking about ESG specifically, and then how that actually opens up a can of worms on the cyber front. So what I mean by that is, for example, and the example that we used was, if you're living in Los Angeles and a lot of public transport, you've got 10,000 staff that need to commute into downtown LA, and you're saying, well, part of our ESG strategy is to say all of our staff are going to work from home, then that shifts another problem to the whole working from home side of things. So I think that what I'm being told from people is, well, I don't know if executives are acutely aware that, yes, it may be a good thing to start to come out in the market and talk about ESG, reducing your carbon footprint, for example, but then maybe not aware on the other complexity from a, opening from a tech point of view, data, but then also a cybersecurity perspective. So I think it's just having that awareness. Are you sort of seeing that too in your sort of experience?
Yeah, I think people are trying to understand what they've got on it from a data perspective. I think, organizations understand they have a lot of data. The data is growing. And I think they're moving from trying to cost manage it to classify it. Sure. Understand what types of information they've got, where are they storing it, do they need to store it, how much personal information is being stored on corporate environments. Policies like Sarbanes-Oxley, backups forever, has been a policy for quite some time. How many copies of the same cat video do you really need to protect? So sure. Organizations now trying to understand what they have, both from a threat landscape perspective as well as the carbon footprint issue. But if you've got data in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're also more vulnerable. So say you apply for a credit card. They collect those 100 points. They store that in a database. What if they don't delete that information? What if you had a tool to run across that environment, understand where that information lives, and then change the policy around that database schema? A, you do reduce your carbon footprint, but B, you also reduce your threat landscape as well.
So I had a discussion with someone yesterday, and I said, what's the likelihood of, people like let's look at a client that's left. You're still holding on to that, PII, sensitive information, whatever it is. And they were sort of saying, well, I don't know if certain customers would even be able to delineate who's a current customer and who's actually left. And I was like, well, why is that? Apparently it's due to legacy systems. What are your thoughts on that? Would you say a lot of businesses within Australia can't tell between who is a current customer and who's not? And then my question is why?
Yeah, I would suspect that would be the case. I don't know that organizations, when you think about how they design these applications, thought about actively tracking whether they're active users or not. On the flip side, I think they also look at that and go, well, if it's a lost customer, it might be an opportunity to regain that customer. So they might be actually wanting to keep that information about the customer inside the system so they can try and regain that customer at some point in the future. But I think you're right. All these things open up opportunity to not only make sure we're keeping the right data, but also making sure that we are not increasing that threat landscape and having data exposed and not in the right place at the right time. And what we're trying to do is move from a reactionary position to a proactive position. So what I mean by that is not cutting a report of where that data might live, that PII information, but what if there was a tool that was driven by AI that could actually learn what is sensitive to that organization and proactively tell them when a developer accidentally puts credit card information into an unsecured S3 bucket and then takes some remedial action to perhaps delete it or protect it, whatever it might be. That's when we need to move organizations through to, because AI and ML is going to have a better job at understanding how to manage that holistic data landscape across multiple clouds
At scale.
than a human being is ever going to do.
But that's a really good point. You're right. Okay, so let's look at the developer example. So absolutely, you should be using, you can't use dummy data to certain levels because you do have to have needs to look legitimate. But that's why data masking comes into it and things like that. But then there's been so many cases, which you're probably aware of, that hasn't been the case because no one's told them, didn't know, pulled the actual data because we need to use data when we're building stuff, and then all of a sudden we've got a problem. Do you see that a lot?
I think that's an internal problem with software development, right? How do we have the right masking of the data? But even when it comes from when they're developing that application with masked data to when it comes into production, and it's not masked data anymore because the information is coming from those transactions with the customers. Exactly. And so that's why we have to have tools that are far more proactive.
But why does anyone think about that?
I think they do think about it. And I think there are frameworks in place. I think it's a hard problem to manage. Let's say you hire a bunch of developers today and you've built all your policies inside Microsoft Azure because that's where you're running your applications. But those developers come in and go, actually, we're not skilled in that environment. We're much more familiar with the environment inside AWS. How do you rewrite those policies and put those things in place? Sure, there's a framework of do's and don'ts, but I think, again, this is where AI and ML can come in and make sure that we protect ourselves from ourselves. And the policies that the organization wants in place around where data is kept, how it's encrypted, et cetera, are automatically applied, regardless of which environment that data and applications are being built in.
But wouldn't there still be anomalies though? Like things get misplaced, it's not going to be 100% accurate.
And I think the tools are getting far better. The algorithms inside these tools learn about that customer's environment. I think we're at a better spot than we were before. There's always going to be mistakes made inside any large organization, but I think what we're trying to do is make sure we minimize those and continue to learn and minimize them as much as possible.
And there you have it. This is KB on the Go. Stay tuned for more.